All right, this session is called Building the Foundation of a Sexual Assault Response Team, presented by Victoria Ybanez, Red Wind Consulting. We are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice, and this is the disclaimer that we are offering. This project is supported by grant number 2019 TAAX K021, awarded by the Office on Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Hi, everybody. I am Victoria Ybanez. I am the Executive Director of Red Wind Consulting. I have been doing this work for about 37 years now. I started out as an advocate working in a domestic violence shelter, and shortly thereafter started working on both sexual assault and domestic violence. My first work started as a legal advocate and then branched out from there, working on-call advocacy as well as facilitating education groups for survivors, and then working in transitional housing, emergency shelter, and then we also had a legal project. It's been 24 years now that I've been working on national tribal technical assistance. I myself am Navajo and Hickory Apache and Mexican descent. And through our tribal technical assistance work, I have worked with housing and homeless services, children and youth, supervised visitation, responses for urban natives, tribal college campuses, sexual assault, as well as developing sexual assault response teams and coordinated community response teams, as well as multiple other things. Red Wind is a TA provider with the Office on Violence Against Women, and we are the tribal government's comprehensive TA provider, as well as we have a tribal college campus project that works with all of the tribal colleges and universities, regardless of funding sources, helping them develop holistic responses to sexual assault. And we work through the Responses for Urban Natives project, providing work with urban programs, native specific ones, as well as non-native specific ones that are wanting to enhance and strengthen their responses to native survivors of domestic and sexual assault. So we'll just get started. And part of this work, it's important for us to talk about prevalence. And there was a report that came out in May of 2016 from the National Institute of Justice. It's the Violence Against American Indian Alaska Native Women. And it came from the national survey that was conducted. And this particular report highlights the findings specific to Alaska Native and American Indian populations. And what's really significant is that over the years, in the work that we've done, we've always known that our Indigenous relatives have had higher levels of prevalence around domestic and sexual violence. And when we think about it, it used to be 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 Native women who had experienced this violence. And when we look at the findings from the National Institute of Justice report, we can look here on the slide, the first column under Native women, 56.1% who have experienced sexual violence, and that's sexual violence in their lifetime. So when we look at that number, 56.1%, we're talking more than 1 in 2 Native women have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And the bullet right below that is 14.4% who have experienced sexual violence in the past year. So significantly higher data than any other population in the United States. And important, we also need to mention our Native men as well, because we have significant prevalence data, significantly higher rates for prevalence data when we look at Native men as well. So the NIJ report came up with 27.5% who have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. So when we look at that number, we're starting to lean toward 1 in 3 Native men who have experienced sexual violence. And this is both of these pieces of data are so significant, because when we look at the responses and the way we're responding, one, when we think of Native men, that often we're not talking about the response for Native men and the importance of being prepared to serve our Indigenous male relatives. And then the fact that we have such high prevalence data for our Indigenous women, that also speaks volumes, because we really aren't seeing that volume coming through the kinds of programs that we're operating. And we'll circle back to that a little bit later in the presentation as we start rolling into talking about more of the specifics of developing a sexual assault response team. So also when we talk about sexual assault, we need to have like a basic understanding for what we're talking about. So sexual assault is an aggressive act motivated by power and control. And I think the core in here is that we really, when we're talking about sexual assault, the key piece in here is there's a lack of consent. And so when we think about that lack of consent, that, you know, we get so many different messages in so many ways that tell us that, you know, that a person may say no, but they mean yes. And, you know, that you could see it in their eyes, they wanted it, or the way they were dressed, you could tell they wanted it. But there's a clear, when we're looking at sexual assault, clearly consent is critical in there. There's either verbally or some form of demonstration of consent, or they lacked the ability to give consent. One of the things that we aren't always aware, we talk about drug facilitated sexual assault, and we aren't often aware that the high prevalence of drug facilitated sexual assault is not necessarily through, you know, roofies in our drink at a bar, that oftentimes it's facilitated through alcohol. So somebody has become intoxicated enough to where they lack the ability to give consent, and it's facilitated by the person who is the perpetrator, who may seek somebody out and help give them drinks. And so consent is a critical aspect in here. And when we think about sexual assault, oftentimes in media, mainstream media, movies, TV, different kinds of ways that we get information, the image of the perpetrator is that stranger, somebody we don't know who is kind of stalking us. That there's a predatory behavior, of course, with sexual assault, but it's clearly not what the mainstream media is telling us. That more likely it's an intimate or an acquaintance. So it could be a partner. So when we talk about sexual assault, we have to remember that sexual assault occurs in intimate relationships, intimate partner relationships between spouses, between somebody who's been dating for a while. So there's this already an established intimate relationship or an acquaintance. So we hear from survivors who talk about, that was my brother's friend, and I can't say anything about it because they have this long history, this long relationship, and I can't, you know, it just doesn't feel like I can bring this open to the community or to my family because of that relationship. One example that we've heard from survivors is, actually a specific example is one where a person had broken down beside the road, and she was really happy that the car that came up happened to be a friend, you know, a friend of the family, somebody that she knew. She didn't know that person real well, but knew enough that she felt safe with that person. And then as a part of getting the ride home, was sexually assaulted in the process, was brought all the way home. But the sexual assault occurred through this acquaintance relationship. So we want to make sure we understand the intimate relationships and the acquaintance relationships as being one aspect that we oftentimes don't think about, and that yes, strangers are perpetrators as well. And then there's a physical act. So when we think about a physical act, and we think about sexual assault, we really want to think about what's our tribal code for sexual assault? What is the federal law on sexual assault? And when we look at the federal statute for what sexual assault is, it's penetration. But when we think about penetration, that we're talking about, oftentimes people think that it's a full penetration and not recognizing that it's just breaking the field, so to speak. And so, some people say, well, it wasn't he attempted to sexually assault her, but he didn't complete it because there wasn't full penetration, but yet he partially penetrated. That person partially penetrated, and it's penetrated in different parts of the body, whether it's the vagina, orally, or anally. And then there's other ways that sexual assaults occur as well, beyond penetration, where we look at ways of being touched sexually that is unwanted. So it could be groping, it could be different forms of touching, using different kinds of objects that of a sexual nature, and it's an unwanted act. So again, always going back to that lack of consent. So when we think about the perpetrator, we want to realize that perpetrator, the images about, I should say the myths about a sexual offender, a sexual perpetrator, is often that there was a loss of control, that they couldn't control themselves, and they just can't manage their sexual urges. And the reality is that it's more of an absolute kind of control. They're very targeted, very specific, very intentional. And as a part of completing those acts, they use threats, coercion, exploitation, deceit, force. They take advantage or intentionally set up situations where they have access to somebody that is physically or mentally incapacitated. And when we think about that, they use power or authority over somebody. So going back to the example of the woman who got a ride from a family friend and ended up being sexually assaulted, one of the things that could have happened was, I'm going to deny it ever happened, and tell people that you threw yourself on me, and who's going to believe you? And there's many different ways that threats, coercion, deceit come into play as well. And then force, one of the things that we hear from people is that there's been different forms of force, where it's threat of force. So going back to thinking about an intimate who is a perpetrator, one of the things that we have heard from survivors is that the intimate partner has said, if you don't submit, I'm going to get my needs met through your daughter. And survivors basically, so we're talking about threats and coercion in there, that they're coercing this person to participate in sex at the threat of their daughter being sexually exploited, sexually assaulted by the perpetrator. So there's many ways this plays out. And I think one of the things that's really important is for the community, as you're looking at and thinking about your response, is to know what's happening in your community. How is this playing out in terms of who the offender is? What are they, how are they approaching sexual assault, and you know, the different ways that they're acting, using threats, coercion, exploitation, deceit, and the rest of those, and knowing how that plays out. Because the other thing we know, and this goes back to the NIJ report, and I would encourage you to go back and Google the National Institute of Justice report that came out in 2016 and look at the full document. It's quite significant. They have an executive summary that you can review as well in the document. But what's important about that is to know that sexual assault, the way it occurs, is that most frequently here in the United States, probably across the world, is that the offender, the perpetrator, usually does not cross racial and ethnic lines. So if the offender is Caucasian, European American, it's a higher likelihood that that perpetrator will sexually assault a Caucasian, European American survivor or victim. And, you know, we can look at that across all the racial and ethnic lines. The exception is American Indian, Alaska Native survivors and victims. Perpetrators are crossing racial and ethnic lines. So you could have a non-Native offender perpetrating violence against American Indian, Alaska Native victims and survivors. And it's important to know that. The other significant data that we got from the NIJ report also was that the victim or survivor of sexual assault was had a higher frequency than any other populations to be sexually assaulted by multiple perpetrators. And then the other piece in there that goes along with that was that the instances of violence through the sexual assault was higher than any other population. So that it was more, there were more injuries of victims that were American Indian, Alaska Native. And so when I say that it's important to know what's going on in your community, what does sexual assault look like, to be able to know what are you dealing with in your own community and how you're going to be responding to that. So knowing that one of the things that when we look at historically some of the challenges around jurisdiction, and many of our tribes, sexual assault falls under the federal crimes. Some of our tribes are exercising their sovereign authority to prosecute sexual assault crimes, but there's a higher likelihood they're federal. And what we know in terms of the limited resources within the federal response and non-natives perpetrating crimes on tribal land, it sets up a situation that makes it more challenging for our tribes to respond to it. So I want to move on and talk a little bit about historical trauma and the social context. And when we think about the historical trauma and social context, one of the things that I always tell advocates is that when we're working with survivors of sexual assault, that we cannot touch this current trauma of the incident that just occurred or recently occurred without connecting back to the historical trauma. And the historical trauma really has a broader impact. So one is that as Indigenous survivors and victims of sexual assault, we carry lots of traumas that have been passed down through multiple generations. And what we know through historical trauma and multiple generational trauma is that the significance of it has had an impact on our DNA. So when we think about, hundreds of years ago and the violence that's been perpetrated against our tribes, that the result of that was so widespread and so significant. And as Dr. Maria Yalahorst Braveheart says on this particular quote, resulting from a cataclysmic history of genocide, that it was so significant that it has imprinted on our DNA and is actually changing us. So we can see today that there's ways that we are carrying historical trauma and multi-generational trauma through the way our health outcomes are. So we have, our mortality rates are different. We die at an earlier age as Indigenous populations. We have high instances of diabetes, cardiac disease, high blood pressure, obesity, others, and multiple other types of ways that historical and multi-generational trauma has affected us. And then when we think about the social impact of it, is that when we look at the timeline of the history of violence that's been perpetrated against our populations, is that we also know that there's many ways that the systems work or don't work, or resistance to accessing systems. So for instance, our Indigenous children continue to be removed at disproportional rates from our families, whereas we had a 100-year period through the boarding school era, and today we are seeing that removal happening through child protective services, where it's disproportional to our populations, where we still have those high rates. We also see, limits to access to quality healthcare. We have limits in terms of through healthcare available to our tribes directly, the resources being significantly lower resources. And then if our population is accessing care in urban centers or in non-native communities, that what we'll find is that then we're faced with discrimination and racism that plays out. And we'll see that seeking healthcare, seeking forensic examinations, and we'll even seeing it as, in instances of seeking other kinds of social services as well. So it's very complex and interconnected. And it's important for us to understand that, because when we think about our response as a sexual assault response team, we need to have a clear understanding of that within what it looks like in our own communities, so that we can be responsive to it and not make assumptions of what we would like it to be. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about, continuing to add some data, is that when we think about reporting, this is really huge, because sexual assault crimes tend to be really underreported. And so this is data from RAIN, which is a national resource center that does a lot of work around sexual assault on a national level. And they basically, what they say is that out of 1,000 sexual assaults, 1,000, only 310 are reported to the police. So less than a third of the sexual assaults are even getting reported. So then when you look at that and I'm just walking down this chart here that's on the slide. So less than a third are reported to the police out of that 1,000. Out of that 1,000, 50 reports lead to an arrest. 50 reports lead to an arrest. So that is really quite shocking. And so when we think about that from a survivor standpoint, then as a survivor, as they understand this, then the question is, why would I subject myself to seeking law enforcement assistance for a sexual assault, If only 50 of them are out of 1,000 are going to go to an arrest, so I'm probably in the 950 other people. So then 28 cases. So a little over half of those 50 that went to an arrest lead to a felony conviction. So 28 cases out of 1,000 lead to a conviction, a felony conviction. And then out of that, so 25 perpetrators will be incarcerated. So thinking about it from a survivor perspective, so victim of sexual assault, particularly within our tribal communities, and that when we think about if we're going to file a police report on somebody living in our community, and out of 1,000, which some of our communities are not even as big as 1,000 people living within our tribal lands, and for some of our tribes, it's quite significantly larger. But out of 1,000, only 25 of those perpetrators will be incarcerated. So there's a high likelihood that perpetrator that is going to continue to be in the community. I'm going to continue to face that perpetrator. That perpetrator is going to move freely about the community, and as a survivor, who might make a police report, is going to be faced with, well, what if that person doesn't get arrested? How does that impact my life? How does it impact the life of my family? How does it impact my ability to move around freely? So we also want to think about what survivors are telling us. So of the sexual violence crimes reported to the police, and so this is a 5-year span, and again, this comes from RAIN, the survivor reporting gave the following reasons. So 28% reported to protect the household or victim from further crimes by the offender. 25% to stop the incident or prevent reoccurrence or escalation. And 21% to improve police surveillance, or they believed they had a duty to do so. And then 7% to catch or punish or prevent the offender from reoffending, and 6% gave a different answer or declined to cite one reason. And 3% did so to get help or recover loss. And so when you look at it, there's quite a range. And when you think about, like, nobody, out of this whole batch of responses, it wasn't like a high response of what motivated people to report to police, but a little bit spread out and multiple different reasons in there. So when we think about our role as wherever we sit in our community, whether we're law enforcement, whether we're a physician or clergy or friend or behavioral health professional or an advocate, there's different ways that we help and different ways that a survivor will reach out. So when we look at this particular chart, the darker lines are who helped, and the lighter lines are who did they tell. So there's a higher likelihood that a survivor or victim of sexual assault will tell a friend. And then it's a significant drop, and the next person is a behavioral health professional. So they're first going to go to their friends and then behavioral health. And then from there, they'll go to a physician, and then just slightly lower than that to law enforcement. And then the very smallest in there of who they tell is an advocate. And while this data is old, it's from 1997, it's still a fairly significant piece of information because, well, one, we don't have current data on it in the same kind of way to show it. But what we know is that survivors and victims of sexual assault don't they don't fully understand what an advocate does. Another is they don't understand all of what law enforcement can do to help, and they don't understand all of what the medical profession can do to help as well. And so when we look at who helped, so advocates had significant help, but when we look at the difference between who they told and what help, law enforcement and physicians are significant help as well. And when we think about part of our work as a sexual assault response team, that for us as practitioners, the more the community understands what we can and cannot do, what the process looks like, and how to access help, and what a victim's rights are when they access help, makes it a huge difference for survivors once they have that kind of information. So when we think about sexual assault response teams, one of the big pieces in here is that it's a coordinated, immediate intervention and services. So the sexual assault response team is making sure that we're working together as a team to meet the needs of survivors, so that when a survivor reaches out to any one of us, we are well connected with everybody. We know what's going to happen, and we can walk that survivor forward based on what they need at that time. So as we're coordinating those interventions and services, we're making sure that they have multiple options, which include victim support, medical care, there's evidence collection and documentation, crime scene investigation, and there's a consistent victim-centered response. And we're promoting healing, and we're working to increase offender accountability. And one of the things that I want to say about a victim-centered response, and we're gonna get to it a little bit more, but I just wanted to say that when we're talking about a victim-centered response, that we're able to offer options. And as a victim-centered response, we're making sure that that particular victim or survivor knows what their options are, and that they're choosing it, and that we're supporting them to move in the path that they want to move. So when we think about a SART, what our SART team is, it's going to vary from tribe to tribe to tribe. And this particular graphic shows the different practitioners who can be involved. And depending on our tribe and our relationship with the federal government will depend on which partners are involved as well. So when we think about it, and I'm going to start from the law enforcement part in the lower right corner. So law enforcement, when we think about them as being involved, we want our tribal police involved. And then depending on our tribe, we may have Bureau Indian Affairs law enforcement. We may be working with the FBI because it's a federal response in there. And then depending on where we're located, we may be also working with a sheriff. And as we move towards, move around the circle, moving left is the prosecutor. And again, thinking about how our tribe is positioned. We of course want our tribal prosecutor to be involved. And if this is a federal case, our U.S. attorney will be involved. And depending on the role of the state in its relationship to the tribe, we may or may not have county prosecutor involved. I'm going to skip the next category and then jump over tribal leadership. And it's important for us to think about our tribal leadership as being involved because tribal leadership makes a huge difference in supporting our project and ensuring the future of our projects. And so when we have tribal leadership involved, we want to be educating tribal leadership. Some of the work of our SART, it's not going to be a meaningful piece of work for a tribal leader to be sitting at every single meeting. So I would want to make sure that at our milestones, we make sure we bring tribal leadership in so they know what we're working on, what our successes are, where we're going. And, so they have a bigger picture of what's going on. And then they may be involved in some aspects of if we're working on developing tribal codes or some other pieces that that bring into policy, things that are going to go to tribal leadership. It would be helpful to have representation at the table. But as I mentioned, our major focus is about the interventions and services as part of the response. So that's not going to be a piece of work that's going to happen frequently. But once it does happen, if we're working on a code or a policy, it may span months or maybe even a year or two. So we'd want to make sure we would have meaningful representation. So we also talk about our traditional practitioners and healers. So when we think about the needs of survivors, we want to think about healing options. And that can show up in multiple places. And so for us within our tribes, it's important for us to be considering our traditional practitioners or healers or spiritual leaders that can bring that aspect into our work, so that as we're coordinating what we need, we're ensuring that we have a culturally centered, culturally appropriate healing options available for survivors in different points of the process. So it's not just when they get to the advocates or when they get to the healthcare setting, because when a survivor might want to talk with the prosecutor or with law enforcement, if the case got reported, that healing can take place in those processes as well. And then our sexual assault forensic exam. So as we think about our examiners and the exam itself, it's important for us to have a protocol in place to ensure that it's a culturally centered approach as well as trauma-informed and victim-centered in that process. And if we're fortunate to have a 24/7 medical facility within our tribe or nearby, we would want to clearly have them involved with our sexual assault response team. And I know Navajo Nation has a few 24/7 facilities. So we would want to make sure that we have, nearby, that we want to make sure that if you're working with a SART within Navajo Nation, are you doing it for a district or a regional area, or are you providing your SART across the nation as a whole? So you want to think about who's being represented within whatever service area you're trying to accomplish. Your forensic lab, it's important for you to be working with the forensic lab. And again, this is one of those partners that may not be at the table all of the time, but is still a critical partner to be present periodically for the work that you're doing. When we think about a forensic lab, we're finding more and more tribes that are sending their evidence to be processed through the state crime lab. But there are still instances that evidence is going through the federal crime lab as well. And sometimes some will go to the state crime lab, some will go to the federal crime lab, or one or the other. And so wherever your evidence is going, you want to make sure that forensic lab is involved in your sexual assault response team, in your SART, because what they want from that crime lab and how they want that evidence brought to them, and understanding their protocols and their timelines are going to be critical for you as workers who are right on the ground and trying to move a case forward. And then healthcare professionals. So when we think about healthcare, there's going to be different ways a survivor is going to seek help. So one way is they may just show up in an emergency room. Another way is they may make a disclosure at a provider visit. So they might be going for their annual physical, or maybe they were injured as a result of the sexual assault and they're seeking some care for that in the aftermath of the violence and the assault. And so it's important for them to be involved to make sure that you've got people trained. And one of the things that I would say about healthcare professionals, we want to make sure that we think about emergency, the EMTs, the emergency responders, because, it's possible they could have been called to the scene. And so that they understand sexual assault, are equipped to be able to respond to it. And that as a part of it, that if this is in fact a sexual assault, that they know what to do at the time, and to make sure that information can process in appropriate ways. And then in the center, we have the tribal sexual assault advocates. And the reason the tribal sexual assault advocate is sitting in the center of it is because they hear a lot of the stories from sexual assault survivors. They're going to work with multiple of the practitioners. They may be a point of contact, helping a survivor or a victim seek a forensic exam, assisting with a survivor or victim filing a police report, assisting with meetings with the prosecutor, providing accompaniment to court if a case goes forward. And if you're working on policies and laws, you may also, an advocate would want to be involved with that, because they hear a lot of the experience of the survivor and can say, this part of the policy can be problematic, or this can be more helpful if it's done this way because of what we know from working with survivors. So this is the core team, and what we know from our tribal communities. It's going to vary from community to community, and you're going to have some inconsistencies. I worked with one tribe. We were working on their sexual assault response team protocol, and while we were doing it, there were some really big cases that went on. The criminal investigator couldn't be involved with the meetings that we were having. The prosecutor had a case that was in court that carried out longer than they had planned. And so the prosecutor couldn't attend. And you need to recognize that there's going to be this kind of, there's going to be a thread that's consistent. And then there's going to be times people just aren't going to be able to be available. And as we think about how we're going to work that team together, we need to be strategic about it. So the example with the tribe, when we were working on protocol, I told the investigator, when he was explaining what was going on, I said, if you get opportunities to just give us a phone call and check in, we will work at holding questions for you so that we can make sure that we can create a draft for you to react to later. And we did the same thing with the prosecutor. And after working on the protocol for 3 days together, it worked out really well. And when they came in and actually got a chance to review the draft, face to face outside of phone calls, it was nearly there. It was like 90%, 95% there, because of the way they would phone in and respond to questions and stuff. And so that was a kind of a strategic thinking to make that work. And so as you think about all of these different pieces, if I was going to have tribal leadership come to the meeting, I would want to make sure that what we're working on when we invite tribal leadership is direct and relevant to them. Same thing with our forensic lab. There's going to be pieces that we're going to talk about where our core is going to be our advocates, our forensic examiner, our law enforcement, and our prosecutors, and others are not going to be as connected to it. But then we'll have maybe work heavy on making sure we're preparing evidence and working within a way that fits within the timeline of the forensic lab. And as a part of that, we want to make sure we have the forensic lab at the table. And then there's the other vested practitioners, which is going to, it's going to be whatever that is in your community. It could be behavioral health. It could be the alcohol and drug folks, drug program through behavioral health. It could be having elders come in and bring some guidance, historical guidance that's going to inform some of the code and policy language, and bringing in custom and practice. And so there's different ways, and you want to think creatively about it. And some of the members are going to be the long-term members. And I would say the core of this group most likely would be long-term. Some of the vested practitioners might be short-term. Healthcare professionals might be sporadic, as I mentioned with some of the others as well. So it'll fit the needs of what your community needs. So when we think about our SART, we also want to think about our victim survivor centered response. And as a part of it, we're addressing the immediate and long-term needs of the victim and our patient. And so our forensic examiners are going to talk about a victim as a patient. Our advocates and our criminal justice staff are going to talk about the survivors as a victim. And so we want to think about, what do they need right now and what do they need later? And through the process, what we know from the criminal justice response is that if a report gets filed and it starts to move forward and is going to move to prosecution, this is something that's not going to happen in a couple weeks. It's not going to be a short-term response or an immediate response. Yes, immediate, filed a police report, but it's not going to stop there. It's going to have a much longer process on it. And what does that victim need in the process? And what are the supports for that victim? And one of the things that I love about the SART is that the more we learn about each other's jobs, we realize we have the resources within our SART team to support each other on it. So for instance, as I have worked with SART teams over the years, one of the things that, I come from an advocate background, and one of the things that initially starting with SART that had been challenging was getting law enforcement and the prosecutor to see that advocates could be a benefit to them. And then part of it is that the relationships weren't there, not understanding really what an advocate can do. But an advocate can deal with those emotional needs and those longer term support needs. So when we think about having an advocate involved with a police report, filing a police report, sometimes people think, well, geez, it might make it a little bit more complicated and stuff, but a well-trained advocate will not interject themselves into an investigation. When we train advocates, we're really clear about that. And at the same time, by advocates being able to provide support, emotional support, and then being connected enough to carry out long-term support with that victim, it actually creates a higher likelihood that that victim will move through the steps in the process. And so when we talk about a longer term process within carrying a case from report to disposition, that having an advocate involved is going to help ensure, not ensure, but have a higher likelihood that a victim can be engaged through that process. And they're going to provide culturally appropriate supports, as well as helping to provide the options. So if we think about like some follow-up interviews, whether it's with the criminal investigator or with the prosecutor's office, and if that particular victim has children, one of the things the advocate can do is to help work out some arrangements for that particular victim to make sure that children are taken care of and that victim has emotional support to go through that. And sometimes it looks like we're just giving a ride or sitting beside them, but in the meantime, in between things, we're helping them understand processes, why things are taking longer, not to be afraid, different kinds of things like that about the system. And then we're making sure when we're talking about victim survivor centered responses, the collaboration with all responding agencies is going to make sure that a victim is not going to fall through the cracks. So as we're looking at everybody coming together, part of our work as a SART team is we're really looking at who's doing what when, and how do we make sure that this victim is supported in these multiple places, and how are we working to hold offenders accountable in those processes. When I work with SART teams, one of the things that I love to do is grab a big pile of different sizes and colored Post-it notes and map out where does a victim have first contact with your office? Is that through a call out where maybe law enforcement gets called to go to the hospital to take a report, or is that a walk-in, or is that a call out to a scene? How do you have first contact with a victim? And then what are the different points in there that the needs for that victim and the processing of that case, and mapping it out on Post-its, because then when I'm looking at it, then I'll look and somebody will say, here's a step. And then I'll say, well, then what? Because they'll think it's a big jump to a next step. And there's like maybe, multiple other smaller steps in there. And the clearer we get in all these steps, we'll make sure that we understand and that we've got everything covered and we have no gaps. So one example, with one SART that I was working with, we were working on the protocol and we had done all the mapping. And one of the things that we found from everybody talking was there was a gap in getting cases moved to the crime lab. And so when we started to talk about that gap, then we said, then what needs to happen? So and then what? So it's, having to make sure this person is assigned when evidence comes in, that it's not only that chain of custody is logged and taken into custody within law enforcement, but then what's the next step that you're going to move it to the crime lab, and who makes that decision, that gives that order to have that happen. And so doing that mapping can help you see those kinds of pieces and what doesn't seem like you don't, because you aren't looking at it, you aren't seeing the gap. So when we're all working together, we can look and say, okay, yeah, it looks good from your side, but it's not seamless how it connects to me. That I need another step in here to make sure that I get a good call out, or I get the order that I need to move something forward. And we make sure that we can have everything that we need in place to process a case. And with that, with our SART teams, we're formalizing policies and procedures to strengthen the capacity of our SART. So the mapping for me is a framework of then what policies and procedures do we need? So if we need a procedure of how evidence is being handled, how it's being handled with a forensic examiner, what are they doing with the evidence, and what's their handoff to law enforcement? Law enforcement, you've got the evidence. What are the steps you need to be taking? And then how does that get handed off to the crime lab? And what gets handed off? Does all of it get handed off, or does part of it get handed off? And you have clear procedures and policies. And for me, when I think about policies and procedures, the important part in there is that we have it well documented, because if we have one turnover, we don't want to lose the whole history of that part of the process. So when it's well documented and everybody has that information, when we have a turnover of staff, someone can sit down and there's documentation to help carry that forward, as well as their peers around them, and the team itself can help make sure that we don't end up with a big hole in the process. So that formalizing of policies and procedures is an important part of the work. And when we think about it, it really is about building the capacity of our SART. So our critical partnerships, we've talked about the different partnerships using the graphic. It's really important that our tribal leadership is connected and can support the development of the sexual assault response, and our partnerships with responding agencies and support services are built for the long-term communication that we're going to have, and that we're addressing myths and obstacles to implementing the sexual assault response. So I mentioned a little while back about knowing how sexual assault, what it looks like in your community. That prevalence data is national data, it is not local data. So you want to know what your local data is, because if without looking at that closely, some of the practitioners on the SART response and in the community are carrying myths. And there are kind of unexpected obstacles that are occurring that are becoming barriers to the sexual assault response. So for instance, one community that I was working with, one tribe, we were there to talk about their SART and give them some framing around how to develop a SART. And so we were starting from just kind of from scratch. And one of the things I asked was, what does a sexual assault case look like in your community? And I said, I know there's not no cookie cutter sexual assault, but you're going to have some things that look, and you have some repeated stories that you're hearing, whether it's a case coming forward or victims coming to advocates, and however that case is coming forward, or it's going to the forensic examiner, there's kind of a way that you're starting to see themes emerge. So we used a whiteboard and people just were telling me stories. And after we spent like about an hour telling these different pieces of stories of, what are the kind of the repetitive stories we're hearing, what we came down to was the frequency within that particular tribe was gang rape. So we were seeing a high instance of sexual assaults occurring where in places where within the tribe where there were parties that young people were having. So they were going to remote locations on the tribe, on the tribal lands, having drinking parties, and then non-natives were coming in. They were aware of these parties and they were coming in and they were bringing maybe half a dozen, 6 to 8 or 9 non-native men that were paid to rape. And so we were seeing young adults, so ranging from like 16 to about 20, was the highest frequency of sexual assaults. And they were happening as a part of gang rapes. Now, this was not the only sexual assault. But as we talked about all of that, there were a few people in that SART team meeting that were shocked. They were shocked to know that this was what was the highest frequency of what was occurring within their tribe. So there was a mistaken assumption that the SART had. So the more we talk about what's going on in the community is important to know how are we going to be responding, not only about, how are we going to patrol the tribe? How are we going to prepare for victims that are coming in who have been sexually assaulted by multiple perpetrators, the types of injuries that might be coming in, different kinds of things like that. So if that's going to be the higher instance, we need to be a little bit more prepared for that. And then the other thing in there is about educating the community about the sexual assault response that's in place and in form of changes to the response as it occurs. So when you're educating the community, so the SART should be the part of educating the community. You are developing a response. You've created a seamless response. You have protocols in place. You've built agreements together with each other so that you know that if somebody is reporting or going to advocacy and not reporting, wherever they're going to get their needs met, then you want to make sure the community knows that. That they know that they don't have to report to police. But if they do report to police, this is what can happen. These are the supports available to them. This is how we're working together to support a victim. This is how we're working together to hold an offender accountable. And you can educate the community in different places. You can educate, like do little snippets on if you've got a radio station. You can have like an interview with SART members talking about the SART response and the work that you've been doing. You can do it at health fairs. There's multiple places within your tribal community to educate the community. So going back to the very low instances of reporting of sexual assault, the more the community knows what you're doing and how you're working together and what you can offer a victim in that process and how you're working to hold an offender accountable, you may have an uptick in reporting that occurs as a result of it. So there are challenges. There are jurisdictional challenges, confidentiality, and there's a whole list here. Turf control issues. We all have limited resources. We may have turnover within our team, different kinds of things like that. And it's important for us to understand our different challenges and how we're going to work that out. So when we think about jurisdictional challenges, years ago when I started advocacy, people would say, people don't know who has jurisdiction. And once I started working closer with law enforcement and prosecutors, it's like, oh yeah, they know their jurisdiction. They absolutely know their jurisdiction. Jurisdictional issues tend to be more of, what are we going to work with? What's our operational plan to make sure if this is falls under a federal crime, how do we notify our federal partners? And are we following the agreements we have in place between our tribe and our federal partners? Do we have a good working relationship across our jurisdictional partners? And how are we sharing evidence in this process? So we need to work out those kinds of jurisdictional issues to make sure that things are seamless and we know what the right hand and the left hand is doing. Confidentiality. A lot of people think that advocates hold an enormous amount of information and don't want to give it up. And so we sit in these SART meetings and we could really help a case if we share information. Well, the reality is there's 2 key points in there. One is that confidentiality is a cornerstone of advocacy that actually is built on safety. And we want to make sure that we don't jeopardize that, because a lot of the victims aren't going to report, and we need to make sure we have a safe space for victims. There is a way that a victim could sign an informed, specific time-limited release for an advocate to share information. And so it's not like we don't want to release information. And if you're working with a victim, you can ask that victim to sign a release. And the advocates also could ask that victim to sign a release. Oftentimes we're sitting in a SART meeting and we can't even say we're working with them. So people think confidentiality is a barrier. The other thing I want to say, the other part about confidentiality is that with confidentiality is that people think we hold a lot of information, and we don't. We don't need to know the details of what happened to be able to work with a victim. So we actually don't have a lot of confidential information we're holding on to. So it's important to understand the limits of each other's jobs. So when I make assumptions about what law enforcement can and cannot do, I'm doing a disservice to our relationship. It's important for me from an advocacy side to have a stronger understanding of the limits and of what law enforcement can and cannot do and what guides them, and vice versa. And we do that, and we share and exchange that information across all of our teams, so that we make sure that we can work cooperatively with each other. So roles and responsibilities as our SART. We're coordinating a victim-centered response, coordinating within and among our respective agencies. And in that, we want to make sure that we're doing it in a trauma-informed, so we're not re-traumatizing. We're improving quality of forensic evidence. We're promoting evidence collection that means applicable standards, meets applicable standards, and promotes successful prosecution. And we're improving the victim survivors' access to justice. And so when we're doing it as a SART, as we're sitting there and we're thinking about what our needs are, we want to keep thinking about what are the victims' needs. And as we're improving the quality of forensic evidence, what are the procedures? What are the processes? What do we need to be doing to improve that quality? And how are we promoting evidence collection that meets applicable standards? and promote successful prosecution. And so when we think about that, how are we doing the investigation? How are we handling the collection of evidence? Are our officers trained on cutting edge methods to be able to collect that evidence? That's going to help and support the prosecution of this case. And then we need to realize justice needs different things to different victims. One, justice wants to get that perpetrator, that offender, arrested, prosecuted, and sent to jail for the rest of their life. Another victim, survivor, may not want anything to do with the criminal justice system. And we need to respect where both of these survivors are. And the more we educate our community, the more we inform them about what their options are and what they can and cannot do. So for a victim, from a victim standpoint, being able to really understand more about what's happening out there in terms of this, that there is a SART team, that you all are working together, and that everybody has their interest at heart, is really comforting. And if everybody is well trained on being trauma informed, that can also be really helpful. One particular case that an assistant U.S. attorney had told me that works in Indian country, he talked about a case that was really, really hard. And it took about 3 years, a little over 3 years, to bring the case to the end, to disposition. And as a part of that, he said that just like almost everything that could go wrong in that case did. And in that process, that victim, from the assistant U.S. attorney and the victim specialists that were involved, the advocate that was involved, and a couple of different law enforcement agencies that were involved, that everybody was working from a trauma-informed approach. In the end, that particular case did not get a conviction, and the victim, her outcome, she felt justice was served for her. And when she talks about that case, so the AUSA talked about it, and then the victim, I heard this at a conference, and the victim talked about that everybody heard her. They listened to her. They treated her with respect. And so she was engaged at multiple points along the way on that case. And which was amazing that that particular victim was able to do that. And the different practitioners working were well trained on how to interview victims, how to communicate with victims, understanding the impacts of trauma and how a victim may communicate their experience with sexual assault. And in that process, in the end, it was justice for the victim. So the more we understand and that we work in a way that's trauma informed, will make a whole huge difference for a case moving forward. So when we think about the benefits to the community and the agencies involved when we're talking about our SARTs, clarity in agency roles, I cannot say how important that is, because we all sit in our own offices. We make assumptions about each other's work, what they can and cannot do, what we think they're doing, what we think they're not doing. And it really does a disservice to each other. So the more we have clarity, the more we can be effective with each other. And we also, that clarity also strengthens our ability to work with each other. And the jurisdictional response within tribal nations, as we have clarity in that. And what I mean by clarity is that we have processes that are clearly laid out, clearly agreed upon. Everybody's educated about them and knows their jobs, and we're working with them in partnerships, because within our tribes and the different jurisdictions, we are working in ways that are different to our non-native, off tribal lands counterparts. So they're often working single jurisdiction. Our tribes may be working 2 or 3 jurisdictions, and that clarity is so important in our work. We create efficiency in the judicial process. We're maximizing all SART responses. We've created a seamless response that is clear, transparent amongst our practitioners, and we've worked the kinks out. It supports higher rates of victim recovery. So when we think about the long-term effects of trauma, that victim recovery is critical. And as we help one survivor in their healing process, we're in fact healing our communities. It supports higher rates of successful prosecution. As we work together, we're providing prosecutors what they need, whether it's through the evidence, through trained officers, witnesses that can come testify clearly about the evidence, and then the supports that survivors need in that process. We've created community dialogue about sexual violence, increased community dialogue. As we think about sexual violence, it's not one of those topics our community wants to talk about. But if we have professionals that are clear about what they're doing and why this is important work, and they're educating the community, it opens up permission for the community to be talking about it, which goes back to higher rates of victim recovery and higher rates of successful prosecution. And then problem solving across agencies is made easier. That knowing each other, working together in partnerships is huge. It's easier to be able to say, when we are working together on our successes, it's easier to be able to say, hey, this is not working out quite so well for us, because we've spent a lot of time talking about our successes as well. So our communications become stronger and more enhanced. So I know I've been giving you a ton of information, and I want to share some resources with you, so that you can pull more information to add to your toolkit, to support the work that you're doing with your own SART work. So one of my favorite resources is the Office for Victims of Crime SART Toolkit. They have a section in there for Indian country, which Redwind assisted them with developing. And their toolkit covers just every aspect of it, from getting started to working on your protocol, looking at your response, working cross-culturally, being trauma informed. It's a really extensive toolkit. So I encourage everybody to look at that. I'm going to skip Redwind and talk about Tribal Law and Policy Institute. They have great resources. You can check out their website. They have different tribal codes, like this, different tribes and their tribal codes on their website. So if you're going to do any revisions to your code, it's always good to go look and see what other tribes are doing. So Tribal Law and Policy Institute has a lot of different codes on there. And then they have a code resource book to give guidance to people on developing, modifying your tribal codes. So that's a great resource that's downloadable from their website. And they also have a SART resource book as well that provides guidance on developing a sexual assault response team. It's quite comprehensive as well. The National Indian Country Clearinghouse on Sexual Assault, NICSA as it's called, has different kinds of resources on it. And the Sexual Violence Resource Center also has resources on it, which are very helpful in the work that you'll do. And then Redwind, we have multiple work that we can provide, make available to you. And then for tribes that are wanting some one-to-one assistance on sexual assault response. If you are a grants to tribal governments grantee through the Office on Violence Against Women, you can make a request for direct TA. And because we are a TA provider on the Comprehensive Tribal Governments Grant Program, it's no cost to someone to be able for us to work with you. And if you are not a grantee of that grant program, we can still work with you, but there's different things we have to work out in terms of cost and that kind of stuff. So as we're coming to the end and we think about the work of a sexual assault response team, I just want to draw some attention to, as you're doing this work, that we do it in a way that we work within harmony and balance, and our work is contributing to the well-being of our tribe and community. We do it with the utmost of respect and love, and we're reflective. We look at where we have come from and where we want to go, and we're intentional in the process of that work. And it's important, as we're doing this SART work, that we take time to care for ourselves as practitioners, because this work is hard work. Wherever we're sitting in there, whether we're an advocate, whether we're law enforcement officers, whether we're criminal investigators or prosecutors or judges or, forensic examiners, any one of the practitioners doing this work, we need to also think about ourselves and how we care for ourselves along the way. And I also would like to ask you to, if you've got any questions or comments, to please put those in the chat. You can, any questions that you do have, the Sexual Assault Services of Northwestern New Mexico will collect those questions and send them to me, and I'll provide an email response back to them that they can send out to all of the participants. So please take the time to do that. Oops, one went too far. And then finally, I just want to offer our information from Red Wind. So if you want to reach out to Red Wind in a general way, you can reach out to our website at www.red-wind.net. And I just want to comment, a lot of people in their minds go to Red Wing. We are Red Wind. So remember that D in there. There's our telephone number and our fax number. And then my direct email is victoria@red-wind.net. And if you want to, you can follow us on Facebook, www.facebook.com/Red Wind Consulting, no spaces. And I want to say thank you all for joining us on this session. I really appreciate having this opportunity about talking about sexual assault response teams. It's an important part of the work that we do, and it makes a huge difference strengthening our sexual assault responses within our tribal communities. So for those of you that are working on sexual assault responses, and if you've already got a sexual assault response team, I hope there's something that from this session that you can take away and has enhanced your thinking about the work that you're doing. And for those of you that don't have a sexual assault response team in your area, I hope this has opened up some thinking around getting started on it. And I can't speak enough about that Office for Victims of Crime SART toolkit. Great resource regardless of where you are in the stages of working on sexual assault response team. So I want to thank you for being here and having me. It's been an honor to share my thoughts and perspectives with you. Thank you.